In the previous video, you learned that addressing climate change is important because studies have shown that it has effects on human health, species extinction, rising sea levels, food security, and extreme weather events. In this video, we will further discuss climate change, its short history, and the response of the international community in order to address this major global problem. Nowadays, there is an increasing propaganda denying and being skeptical of climate change. These groups claim that climate change is not caused by humans. Some of them claim that the projected effects of climate change are overblown. However, among experts on climate change and climate science, there is a very strong scientific consensus that the current global warming that the Earth is experiencing is actually caused by human activities. Actually, we have been warned by climate scientists decades ago of this global warming that will happen if we do not take appropriate action. Let's look at a brief history of climate science. Climate science goes back to the 1800s. The scientist Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier was the first to describe the greenhouse effect. That's where energy coming from the sun can easily pass through the Earth's atmosphere, but the infrared radiation emitted by the Earth's surface could not make it back the opposite direction. In the mid-1850s, scientists Foote and Tyndall independently found out that carbon dioxide traps heat that could cause changes in global temperature. This was validated further by Arrhenius in the late 1800s. Interest in climate science was revived after World War II, after a period of skepticism in climate science in the early 1900s. In the mid-1950s, Gilbert Plas warned that CO2 could cause climate change by the end of the century. In the late 1950s, the yearly monitoring of CO2 in the atmosphere was started. From 1970s to 1980s, a lot of development happened in climate science. For example, other sources of emissions were identified. The other greenhouse gases aside from CO2 were identified as well. In 1981, Tom Wigley and Phil Jones again warned that by the end of the century, the CO2 concentration will become sufficiently high that a climatic change will become unavoidable. And then in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, was created. So IPCC is the internationally accepted authority on climate change. The objective of the IPCC is to provide the world with objective scientific information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of human-induced climate change, its natural, political, and economic impacts and risks, and the possible response options. The IPCC produces reports that have the agreement of leading climate scientists and consensus from participating governments. The IPCC reports cover scientific, technical, and socio-economic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of climate change and its potential impacts. Here are some of the reports that the IPCC has produced. 5 comprehensive assessment reports reviewing climate science. This comes out almost every 5 years. They also have special reports on specific topics. And they also have 2 methodology reports on greenhouse gas inventory. And then in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, was established. UNFCCC is an international environmental treaty that aims to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent this dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The Philippines is a party to the UNFCCC. The parties meet annually in what we call a Conference of Parties, or COP, to assess the progress in dealing with climate change. In the third COP in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. So this protocol commits developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this protocol is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So what that means is that individual countries, they have different capabilities in combating climate change. So thus, developed countries should be obligated to reduce emissions on the basis that they are historically responsible for the current levels of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So what happened in the Kyoto Protocol, it has two commitment periods. The first one in 2008 to 2012, the second one in 2012 to 2020. So for the first commitment period, all 36 countries that fully participated complied with the protocol. However, even though the 36 countries reduced their emissions, the global emissions increased by 32% from 1990 to 2010. So this is because developing countries have increasing energy consumption in order to sustain their economy. So therefore, this increase in energy consumption led to an increase in GHG emissions. In the second commitment period, 37 countries have binding targets. Several countries did not participate in the second round that participated in the first round, and these are US, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, and Russia. Okay, so in the 21st Conference of Parties in Paris, France in 2015, a landmark agreement was established. This essentially replaces the Kyoto Protocol. This became known as the Paris Agreement. So one of the objectives of the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and also to pursue efforts to limit this increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under Paris Agreement, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, not only developed countries have reduction targets. For Paris Agreement, each country must determine, plan, and regularly report on the contribution that it undertakes to mitigate global warming. This contribution by each country is called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDC. So why does the Paris Agreement target a below 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase? Well, because a 2 degrees Celsius warming could exacerbate the weather, cause rising sea levels, and diminishing Arctic sea ice, coral bleaching, loss of ecosystems, among other impacts. This is actually one of the key findings of the IPCC's special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius published in 2018. Further, the report says that meeting a 1.5 degrees Celsius target is possible, but would require deep emissions reduction and rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of the society. So to summarize, there is a strong scientific consensus that the current global warming is caused by human activities. Our current understanding of climate change and climate science is actually a result of 200 years of inquiry, discovery, innovation, and problem solving. And there is a currently global response to fight climate change, and all countries have emission reduction targets. Well, that ends this module on the basics of the Philippine energy sector, where we discussed overview of energy, electricity, and climate change. We also discussed challenges we are currently facing, as well as policies in place to address these challenges. In the next module, you will learn about the opportunities in the renewable energy sector.